There is something profoundly ironic about war. There is something that defies all human logic when we underestimate what we do not fully understand. This is the story of how laughter turned to respect, how mockery turned to silent terror, and how an aircraft considered inadequate by its enemies became one of the most fearsome combat instruments of World War II. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that German pilots ridiculed until the moment its 850 machine guns began sinking ships in the North Sea. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about the time you watched this video. Now let's dive into this extraordinary narrative. It was 1943, and Europe was plunged into the darkness of the most devastating war humanity had ever witnessed. The skies over the European continent were the scene of daily battles between Allied and German fighters, each encounter deciding not only the fate of individual pilots, but potentially the course of entire military campaigns. Into this landscape emerged an aircraft that at first glance seemed anything but elegant or intimidating. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a behemoth compared to the fighters of the time. Weighing nearly 7 tons fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. Its robust body and squat appearance earned it unflattering nicknames. American pilots themselves called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, but also a reference to its jug-like shape. It was an aircraft that seemed to have been built from leftovers from other projects, a machine that defied the basic principles of aerodynamics that made European fighters so graceful. When the first P-47s began appearing in European skies, Luftwaffe pilots watched with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Here was an aircraft that seemed better suited for carrying cargo than for aerial combat. Compared to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the lethal Focke-Wulf FW-190, the Thunderbolt resembled an elephant trying to compete with panthers. German pilots, veterans of years of combat over Europe and the Soviet Union, had developed a healthy respect for adversaries like the British Supermarine Spitfire, an aircraft that harmoniously combined speed, maneuverability, and firepower. But this new American, this lumbering giant that seemed to lumber through the sky? It became the butt of jokes in German briefing rooms. Initial reports from Luftwaffe pilots confirmed their prejudices. The P-47 couldn't turn as nimbly as a 109. It lacked the instant acceleration of an FW-190 at low altitude. It felt heavy, slow to respond. An aircraft that struggled against its own weight with every maneuver. In early combat over France and the Low Countries, German pilots discovered they could easily outmaneuver the Thunderbolt in turning maneuvers, a key tactic in aerial combat at the time. It was as if the Americans had sent an aircraft from a previous era, a dinosaur into a world that demanded speed and agility above all else. Laughter rippled through German bases. Stories circulated about how easy it was to evade a P-47, how all you had to do was enter a tight turn and watch the American giant struggle to keep up. Luftwaffe confidence was high, but there was something the German pilots hadn't yet fully grasped. There were aspects of the P-47 that weren't immediately apparent from a chance encounter in the skies. The Thunderbolt was designed around a unique engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. This engine wasn't just powerful, it was incredibly robust. It could absorb damage that would destroy more delicate engines and still function. Most importantly, the P-47 was equipped with a turbocharger that allowed it to maintain its power at altitudes where other fighters were beginning to feel the effects of thin air. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was no longer the lumbering giant struggling to turn. Up there, where the air was thin and cold, it transformed into something completely different. The P-47's true genius, however, lay in its diving ability. What seemed like a disadvantage in spin combat became a devastating advantage when gravity was added to the equation. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any German fighter. In a steep dive, it could accelerate to speeds that made other fighters tremble and threaten to disintegrate. The P-47's airframe was incredibly strong, built with a robustness that reflected the American engineering philosophy of the time. It wasn't elegant, but it was virtually indestructible. This combination of weight, power, and solid structure meant a P-47 pilot always had a way out. If the going got tough, if a German fighter gained an advantageous position, the American pilot could simply push the stick forward and dive away from danger, knowing that no German could follow without risking disintegration of their own aircraft. But there was another aspect of the Thunderbolt that would become its most feared feature. 8 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. This wasn't just a matter of quantity. Although 8 heavy machine guns were certainly impressive in their own right, it was a matter of what these weapons could do. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun was and remains one of the most effective weapons ever designed. Firing approximately 13-gram projectiles at velocities exceeding 2,700 feet per second, these rounds had exceptional penetrating power. Most importantly, they could be loaded with a variety of specialized ammunition, armor-piercing ammunition, incendiary ammunition, and tracer ammunition. A P-47 pilot had over 3,400 rounds at his disposal, enough for approximately 30 seconds of continuous fire. 30 seconds may not seem like much, but in aerial combat, where bursts are measured in fractions of a second, it was an eternity. More significantly, it was more than enough ammunition for multiple attack passes. The first months of P-47 combat operations over Europe were a learning curve for both sides. American pilots quickly discovered that attempting to fight the Germans using traditional European turn-based combat tactics was a disaster. The Thunderbolt simply wasn't designed for that kind of fighting. But under the guidance of visionary leaders and through hard-won experience, American pilots developed tactics that played to the P-47's strengths. Energy and speed became the watchwords. Pilots learned to use altitude and diving speed to compensate for the reduced maneuverability of horizontal turns. The boom and zoom tactic, attacking from above, firing, and then diving away before the enemy could respond, became the signature of Thunderbolt pilots. And when those 850 machine guns found their target, the results were devastating. A German fighter hit by a concentrated burst of 8.50 rounds didn't have much hope. The sheer number of shells, the kinetic energy involved, was simply overwhelming. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s reported a terrifying experience. The sound of bullets piercing metal, the vibration of the aircraft being torn apart, the certainty that if a few more shells found vital components, it would all be over. Luftwaffe pilots began to develop a grudging respect for the Thunderbolt. The jokes began to diminish. Underestimation gave way to a cautious recognition that this was not an adversary to be ignored, but the true transformation in German perception of the P-47 did not come from aerial combat over France or Germany. It came from a completely different application of the Thunderbolt, a mission for which it was not originally designed, but for which it proved exceptionally well suited. That mission was ground attack and, more specifically, attacks against naval targets in the North Sea. The North Sea, that cold, stormy body of water separating Great Britain from continental Europe, was a vital artery for Germany during World War II. German naval convoys used coastal routes along the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway to transport supplies, troops, and equipment. These routes were considered relatively safe. Constant air patrols, heavy coastal defenses, and the proximity of Luftwaffe bases made Allied attacks risky and often costly. Merchant ships, naval escorts, and small warships all used these routes with a reasonable sense of security. It was in this context that Allied commanders began to consider the P-47 not just as a fighter, but as a strike platform. The aircraft's ruggedness, its ability to absorb considerable damage and continue flying, and above all those 8 heavy machine guns, suggested intriguing possibilities. What if the Thunderbolt could be used to attack surface targets? What if those 8.50 guns could be directed not against other aircraft, but against ships, trains, vehicles? The idea was audacious. Fighters were traditionally used against other aircraft. Bombers attacked surface targets, but the lines were blurring and warfare was evolving. Early experimental missions against ground targets showed promising results. The P-47 could dive onto a train or a column of vehicles and literally disintegrate them with its firepower. But what about naval targets? That would be different. Ships had armor. They had anti-aircraft defenses. These were targets that could fight back significantly. The first missions against German convoys in the North Sea were conducted with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The P-47 pilots knew they were trying something new, something their training manuals hadn't covered in detail. Approaching a ship at high speed, low altitude, over open water, all while facing anti-aircraft fire, was a daunting proposition. But the pilots were well-trained, courageous, and about to discover exactly what their aircraft could do. The first attacks were revelatory. Flying in low formations, just a few feet above the waves to avoid radar detection, the P-47s would approach German convoys at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. At the last moment, they would climb slightly to gain a clear line of sight on their targets, and then open fire. What happened next surprised even the most optimistic pilots. When 850 machine guns, each firing between 700 and 800 rounds per minute, were directed at a ship's superstructure, the results were catastrophic. Armor-piercing ammunition punched through steel plates designed to withstand rifle or light machine gun fire. Incendiary ammunition started fires in anything flammable. Flight decks were destroyed. Gun turrets were disabled. Crews on open decks were decimated. And here's the truly revolutionary aspect. The P-47s discovered they could not only damage ships, but sink them. Smaller merchant ships, escorts, minesweepers, and patrol boats, when hit by sustained bursts of 850 rounds, began to take on water and sink. The machine guns punched through the hull at or near the waterline. The number of holes created by thousands of shells overwhelmed the capabilities of the ship's damage control systems. Fires spread. Secondary explosions occurred when the ship's ammunition was hit. Crews abandoned ship, and ship sank. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. The idea that fighters, aircraft designed for aerial combat, could pose a lethal threat to ships was something they had not adequately anticipated. Their naval anti-aircraft defenses were designed primarily against bombers, aircraft that would attack from medium to high altitudes, giving gunners time to track and engage. The P-47s did not do that. They appeared out of nowhere, flying so low that they were nearly impossible to detect until the last moment, and then unleashed a deluge of fire before disappearing again. The time between detection and attack was measured in seconds. This was insufficient time for a coordinated response. By the time the German gunners could begin firing, the P-47s were already moving away. Their speed and low-altitude maneuverability making them extremely difficult targets. And even when they did manage to hit a Thunderbolt, they found that the aircraft could absorb surprising amounts of damage and keep flying. There were reports of P-47s returning to base with hundreds of shell holes, damaged engines, leaking hydraulic systems, and still managing to land safely. Stories of these attacks began to spread. P-47 pilots returned from missions over the North Sea with reports of ships left burning, sinking, and crews jumping into the icy water. The gun cameras installed on the Thunderbolts captured dramatic images of these attacks, footage that would be analyzed by Allied commanders with growing interest. Here was a capability they had not fully anticipated. Here was a way to disrupt German shipping that didn't require heavy bombers or risky torpedo attacks. The P-47s could do it alone, using only their machine guns. The economy of the situation was remarkable. Each P-47 mission cost relatively little in terms of resources. The aircraft burned fuel and fired ammunition, but there was no need for expensive bombs or complex torpedoes, and the pilot survival rate was encouragingly high, especially compared to heavy bombing missions. The Thunderbolt's ruggedness meant that even when hit, it usually brought its pilot home. For Germany, this new threat posed a serious problem. Shipping along their coasts, something they had considered relatively safe with adequate defenses, was now under constant attack. Convoys were attacked. Ships were sunk. Vital cargo was lost in the cold North Sea. The German response was to increase anti-aircraft defenses on ships, provide more fighter escorts, and attempt to improve early warning systems. But these measures were limited in their effectiveness. The P-47s were too fast, attacked from too unexpected angles, and their firepower was simply overwhelming. The morale of German naval crews began to suffer. Making a trip along the coast, something previously considered routine, now carried the constant risk of a devastating attack by American Thunderbolts that could appear at any moment. Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom had ridiculed the P-47 in its early days, now faced the task of trying to protect these convoys. It was a frustrating and dangerous duty. The Thunderbolts flew so low over the water that detecting them was extremely difficult. When German pilots managed to intercept them, They often arrived too late after the attack had already occurred. And when they did manage to engage the P-47s in combat, they discovered that underestimating the aircraft was a potentially fatal mistake. Those Thunderbolt pilots had become very experienced. They knew how to use their aircraft. They knew when to fight and when to run. And when they did decide to fight, those 850 machine guns were a force of nature. The narrative had completely changed. The aircraft that had been the butt of jokes was now feared. The lumbering giant had proven itself to be an exceptionally effective instrument of destruction. There are numerous specific stories from this North Sea campaign that illustrate the effectiveness of the P-47 in these missions. There are reports of a formation of 4 Thunderbolts encountering a convoy of 5 merchant ships escorted by 2 armed minesweepers. Within minutes, 2 merchant ships were on fire and 1 minesweeper was sinking. Anti-aircraft defenses managed to damage 1 P-47, but all 4 Thunderbolts returned to base. There is the story of a lone P-47 pilot who encountered a German patrol boat. In a single strafing pass, he silenced the ship's anti-aircraft artillery and caused enough damage that the ship was later found abandoned by its crew. There are reports of attacks against larger convoys involving dozens of P-47s, creating scenes of absolute chaos as ships attempted evasive maneuvers while being fired upon from multiple directions simultaneously. A particularly remarkable aspect of these attacks was the precision the P-47 pilots developed. Strafing is not an exact science. It requires judging distance, compensating for speed leading the target, all while flying at hundreds of miles per hour. But the pilots became exceptionally skilled at it. They learned exactly where to target a ship for maximum damage. The bridge to neutralize control, the engine bay to immobilize the ship, the waterline to cause flooding, the gun turrets to reduce defensive capability. It was a brutal but effective art form, and the more missions they flew, the better they became. The learning curve was steep, but the results spoke for themselves. Mission records show a steady increase in the success rate. Early missions could damage ships. Later missions sank them with predictable regularity. The Germans' psychological response to this campaign is fascinating to consider. There was an element of humiliation involved. The German Navy, which had proudly sailed the seas at the beginning of the war, now saw its ships being sunk not by other ships, not by submarines, but by fighters. By planes that didn't even carry bombs or torpedoes, but simply machine guns. There was something deeply offensive about this to the German military mentality. There was also genuine fear. The ship's crews knew their chances were limited if caught by a formation of P-47s. Survivors' accounts described the terror of seeing these aircraft approaching at full speed, knowing that within seconds there would be a hell of a bullet ripping through the ship. Many chose to simply abandon ship at the first sign of approaching American fighters, preferring to risk the icy waters of the North Sea rather than face the machine guns. On the Allied side, P-47 pilots developed a reputation as maritime attack specialists. Missions over the North Sea were considered challenging but rewarding. There was the inherent danger of flying over water, where a mechanical problem likely meant death from hypothermia in the frigid waters. There were the anti-aircraft defenses. There was always the possibility of being intercepted by Luftwaffe fighters. But there was also the tangible satisfaction of seeing immediate results. Unlike some bombing missions where the results were ambiguous, a ship sinking is unequivocal. The pilots knew exactly what they had accomplished. The statistics speak for themselves. During the period 1943-1945, P-47 Thunderbolts sank or seriously damaged hundreds of ships in the North Sea and other European waters. These were not just small patrol boats. They included substantial merchant ships, naval escorts, and even occasionally smaller warships. The tonnage lost by Germany due to these attacks was significant and contributed to the growing logistical crisis the nation faced. It's important to contextualize this story within the broader narrative of the P-47 in World War II. While naval raids in the North Sea represent a dramatic and relatively lesser-known aspect of the Thunderbolt's operations, the aircraft was simultaneously distinguishing itself in multiple other roles. As a fighter escorting bombers over Germany, the P-47 was instrumental in achieving air superiority. As a fighter bomber attacking ground targets, It destroyed countless locomotives, bridges, vehicle convoys, and fortified positions. P-47 pilots included some of the war's most successful aces. The aircraft served in every theater of operation, from Europe to the Pacific, from Italy to China. But it was perhaps in the skies over Europe and the waters of the North Sea that the Thunderbolt truly made its reputation. The transformation in German. Perception of the P-47 is a fascinating study in military psychology. At first, underestimation and ridicule. In the middle, grudging respect. At the end, genuine fear. Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war spoke in later interviews about various Allied aircraft with varying degrees of respect. The Spitfire was admired for its elegance and maneuverability. The P-51 Mustang was feared for its range and ability to pursue the Germans to their own bases. But the P-47 was described in almost apocalyptic terms when configured for ground attack. The combination of heavy armor, massive firepower, and extreme survivability made it an adversary that simply could not be reliably stopped. A German fighter pilot could occasionally shoot down a P-47, but it required a combination of skill, luck, and perfect positioning. And even when they did manage to inflict damage, they often watched in disbelief as the Thunderbolt flew on. The technical innovations that enabled the P-47's effectiveness in anti-shipping missions are worthy of closer consideration. The ammunition used in missions over the North Sea was often a carefully calibrated mix. Armor-piercing rounds to penetrate steel plates, incendiary rounds to start fires, tracer rounds to aid aiming. This mix was no accident. It was based on experience and careful analysis of which types of damage were most effective against naval targets. Pilots and gunners worked together to optimize the ammunition loadout for specific missions. A mission against shipping might use a different mix than a bomber escort mission. This level of customization reflected a sophisticated understanding of ballistics and terminal effects that was years ahead of its time. The P-47's own structure also deserves recognition. Alexander Kartvel's design resulted in an aircraft that was fundamentally robust. The fuselage was built around the massive engine and included extensive armor plating to protect the pilot. The fuel tank eventually became self-sealing, meaning that small bullet holes wouldn't necessarily result in catastrophic fuel loss. The control systems were redundant. Many critical components were duplicated or protected. This design philosophy meant that a P-47 could sustain damage that would destroy more delicate aircraft and still fly. There are extraordinary stories of P-47 survival. Aircraft returning with entire engine cylinders destroyed, still flying. Thunderbolts with portions of their wings ripped off by anti-aircraft fire, still controllable. Even cases of P-47s crashing into ground targets during strafing attacks and still managing to return to base. This robustness wasn't just a technical advantage, it was a huge psychological factor for the pilots. Knowing that their aircraft were resilient gave them the confidence to press attacks in the face of heavy defenses. Confidence that translated into operational effectiveness. P-47 pilot training also evolved in response to the missions they were being asked to perform. Initial fighter pilot training focused primarily on aerial combat, formation tactics, navigation, and the fundamentals of flying the aircraft. But as ground attack missions became more common, additional training programs were developed. Pilots learned strafing techniques, how to estimate ranges over water, how to identify and prioritize naval targets, how to coordinate attacks with other members of the formation, and critically, how to survive the experience. Flying low over water is inherently dangerous. One error in judgment, one moment of disorientation, and a pilot could easily fly straight into the waves. Training emphasized discipline, situational awareness, and judgment under pressure. The pilots who eventually flew these missions over the North Sea were highly trained professionals who had been specifically prepared for the type of combat they would face. There's also the strategic dimension of this campaign to consider. The P-47 attacks on German shipping were not just about sinking individual ships. They were part of a broader effort to strangle the German war economy. Each ship sunk represented supplies that would not reach their destination. Each disrupted convoy meant delays in German military operations. The cumulative effect over months and years was significant. Germany was already under pressure from multiple directions. Strategic bombing was destroying its industrial capacity. Land advances were capturing vital territory. Naval blockades were reducing imports. And now, even its coastal shipping routes, which had been considered relatively safe, were under constant attack by fighters that could appear without warning and cause devastating destruction. The pressure was relentless, and it contributed to the eventual collapse of the German war machine. The human aspects of this story are also worthy of reflection. Each mission over the North Sea was flown by young men, many still in their 20s, who regularly faced mortal danger. Flying over hostile waters in an aircraft made of metal and flammable fuel, knowing that at any moment anti-aircraft fire could turn everything into a fireball, required extraordinary courage. These pilots were motivated by several things. Patriotic duty, certainly, loyalty to their comrades, the desire to contribute to the defeat of a regime that represented genuine evil, but also simply the professional duty of doing their job to the best of their ability. The diaries and letters of these pilots, when available, reveal men who were simultaneously deeply aware of the seriousness of their task and determined to perform it competently. These were not all movie heroes seeking glory. They were professionals doing incredibly dangerous work because someone had to. On the German side, too, there were human dimensions to consider. The crews of the ships that were attacked were often older men or junior sailors, not considered suitable for frontline service. For them, these convoy missions should have been relatively safe. Instead, they found themselves in the line of fire of one of the war's most lethal weapons. Accounts from German survivors speak of the sheer terror of these attacks, of the helplessness of being on a ship being torn apart by thousands of shells, knowing there was nowhere to hide, no way to effectively fight back. It was a form of warfare that offered no glamour or honor, only survival or death. As 1944 progressed and the Normandy invasion approached, the P-47's role expanded even further. The same tactics that had been so effective against shipping in the North Sea were applied against transport targets throughout occupied France. Bridges were destroyed. Trains were turned into wreckage. Vehicle convoys were annihilated. The P-47 became the quintessential instrument of interdiction, the tool Allied commanders used to prevent German forces from moving and reinforce critical positions. In the immediate post-D-Day period, when German forces attempted to move panzer divisions into Normandy to repel the invasion, they found daylight movement virtually impossible. The sky was filled with Thunderbolts and other Allied fighter bombers, attacking anything that moved. The contribution of these attacks to the success of the Normandy invasion cannot be underestimated. But returning specifically to the North Sea and naval attacks, there is one aspect of this story that deserves particular emphasis. This was a transformation of military doctrine happening in real time. At the beginning of the war, there were clearly defined roles for different types of aircraft. Fighters fought other fighters. Bombers attacked strategic targets. Specialized attack aircraft dealt with tactical ground targets. But the realities of war forced a re-evaluation of these rigid categories. The P-47 proved that a well-designed and well-armed fighter could transcend its original role. It could simultaneously be a superior fighter, a devastating fighter bomber, and a lethal ship destroyer. This versatility represented an evolution in military thinking that would influence aircraft design for decades. After the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt's legacy extends far beyond World War II. The aircraft remained in service with various air forces through the 1950s and beyond. The design principles that made it effective, ruggedness, heavy firepower, survivability, influenced subsequent generations of attack aircraft. The Republic Aviation Company, which designed the P-47, would go on to produce the F-84 Thunderjet and eventually the famous A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft that bears the name and inherits many of the design principles of its World War II predecessor. The modern A-10, with its 30mm Ju-8 Avenger cannon and rugged construction, is a direct descendant in philosophy of the original P-47. Both represent the idea that an aircraft designed to survive and deliver devastating firepower can be more effective than a more elegant but fragile one. The P-47's final World War II statistics are impressive by any measure. More than 15,000 Thunderbolts were produced. They flew more than 500,000 combat missions. They were credited with destroying thousands of enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They destroyed countless locomotives, vehicles, bridges, and structures. And, critically for our history, they sank or damaged hundreds of ships. The P-47's loss rate was remarkably low, considering the number of combat missions it flew and the level of risk involved. This is a testament to both the quality of the aircraft and the skill of the pilots who flew it. Many P-47 pilots survived the war with hundreds of combat missions, an extraordinary feat that would have been nearly impossible in a less capable aircraft. The lessons of the P-47's North Sea campaign were studied extensively after the war. Military analysts recognized that something significant had happened. An aircraft had been used in a way not intended by its original design, and it had been extraordinarily successful. This led to thinking about flexibility in aircraft design, about the importance of versatile weapon systems that could be adapted to multiple missions. It influenced doctrine on how to engage naval targets. It confirmed the importance of raw firepower in certain situations, and it reinforced the notion that underestimating an adversary, whether an aircraft or a nation, is a potentially catastrophic mistake. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way. It's fascinating to consider how history might have been different if the P-47 had been designed differently. What if Republic aviation engineers had prioritized agility over ruggedness? What if they had installed only 4 machine guns instead of 8 to save weight? What if the airframe had been lighter, more fragile? The aircraft might have been better in traditional gyro combat, but it would have lost the characteristics that made it so devastating in ground attack and against naval targets. The design decisions that were made, which seemed disadvantageous when the aircraft was first introduced, proved to be precisely what was needed for the kind of war that would eventually be fought. There's a broader lesson here about military planning and equipment design. It's not always possible to predict exactly how a piece of equipment will be used in actual combat. Flexibility, ruggedness, and adaptability can be more valuable than extreme optimization for a specific role. The psychological dimension of the transformation in German perception of the P-47 cannot be overstated. Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot in early 1943, confident in your abilities and your aircraft, gazing with amusement at this clumsy new American fighter. Now fast forward to 1944, and that same pilot is nervously glancing skyward, knowing that formations of Thunderbolts are out there, capable of appearing at any moment, capable of destroying ground targets, naval targets, or enemy aircraft with equal effectiveness. Confidence gave way to apprehension. Perceived superiority gave way to the recognition that the Allies had developed weapons that were simply superior in many respects. This psychological erosion of confidence, multiplied by thousands of German pilots and aircrew members, contributed to the eventual decline of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. For the Allies, the P-47's success provided a significant morale boost. Here was tangible evidence that American industrial production could create weapons that not only equaled but exceeded in some respects those of its adversaries. Workers at Republic Aviation factories, many of them women who had assumed traditionally male roles during the war, could read mission reports and know that their work was making a real difference. The pilots who flew the aircraft developed a deep bond with the Thunderbolt. Many credited the aircraft's ruggedness, with saving them when they were hit by enemy fire. Stories circulated of P-47s bringing pilots home despite horrendous damage, cementing the aircraft's reputation as a machine that cared for those who flew it. International cooperation also played a role in this history. While the P-47 was primarily an American aircraft, flown by American pilots, it also served with Allied air forces. British, Free French, Polish, Brazilian, and other pilots flew Thunderbolts in combat. Each brought their own perspectives and tactics, contributing to the continuing evolution of how the aircraft was used. Brazilian pilots, in particular, became known for their aggressive ground attack missions in Italy, flying P-47s to great effect against fortified German positions. This international dimension to the Thunderbolt's history is a reminder that World War II was truly a global endeavor, with nations from around the world contributing to the eventual defeat of the Axis. The technical challenges of keeping a fleet of P-47s, operational under combat conditions, should also not be underestimated. The R-2800 engine, while robust, was a complex piece of machinery that required regular and skilled maintenance. The 8 machine guns needed to be cleaned, adjusted, and harmonized regularly. The hydraulic, electrical, and fuel systems all required constant attention. The ground crews that kept these aircraft flying worked long hours in often difficult conditions, often under threat of enemy attack. Without their dedicated work, the pilots could not have accomplished their missions. This is another often overlooked dimension of aerial combat stories. For every pilot in the air, there were dozens of people on the ground making that flight possible. Mechanics, armorers, radio specialists, and supply personnel all played crucial roles in the P-47's overall success. As the war in Europe neared its end in the spring of 1945, the P-47 continued to operate at high intensity. Missions over the North Sea continued, though targets were becoming increasingly scarce as the German Navy shrank under constant pressure. The focus shifted more to direct support of ground troops advancing through Germany. Thunderbolts flew close support missions, attacking German defensive positions, providing cover for Allied troops and generally contributing to the final push that would lead to victory. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, P-47 pilots could look back on their contributions with justifiable pride. They had flown an aircraft that many had underestimated, and they had proven it to be one of the most versatile and effective of the conflict. In the Pacific, the P-47 also saw extensive service, though its history there is often overshadowed by that of the P-51 Mustang in long-range combat and the F-6F Hellcat in naval fighter combat. But the Thunderbolts in the Pacific, particularly in the Philippines and Okinawa, continued the tradition of ground attack effectiveness that had been established in Europe. Against Japanese ground targets, bunkers, and fortified positions, the 8 machine guns proved as devastating as they had been against European targets. The aircraft's ruggedness was also valuable in the Pacific, where long missions over water meant that mechanical reliability was literally a matter of life or death. Reflecting on this entire story, what emerges is a narrative of underestimation, adaptation, and triumph. The German underestimation of the P-47 was based on first impressions and preconceptions about what a fighter should be. When confronted with the reality of what the Thunderbolt could actually do, particularly in its devastating role attacking shipping in the North Sea, these first impressions were violently discarded. The American ability to adapt the aircraft to roles for which it was not originally designed demonstrated flexibility and innovative thinking, and the P-47's ultimate triumph as one of the most successful aircraft of the war validates the design decisions that were made, even those that initially seemed disadvantageous. This is a story about how warforces innovation, how equipment should be judged not by paper specifications but by actual combat performance, and how underestimating an adversary is always a dangerous mistake. The numbers tell a story in themselves. Thousands of P-47s produced, hundreds of thousands of missions flown, thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, tens of thousands of ground targets eliminated, hundreds of ships sunk or damaged, and through it all a pilot survival rate that was remarkably high given the level of risk. These statistics represent individual stories of courage, skill, and sacrifice. They represent engineers who designed an exceptional aircraft. They represent factory workers who built it. They represent ground crews who kept it running. And above all, they represent pilots who flew it in combat, day after day, mission after mission, against a determined and dangerous enemy. The P-47's transformation from an object of ridicule to an instrument of terror is more than just an interesting historical curiosity. It's a lesson in perception versus reality, in the importance of not judging by appearances, in how true capabilities are only revealed under the pressure of real combat. The German pilots who laughed at the Thunderbolt in its early days learned a hard lesson. Those who survived to tell the tale spoke of the P-47 with a mixture of respect and fear, and the American pilots who flew the aircraft developed a deep affection for it, recognizing that its ruggedness and firepower gave them chances of survival they wouldn't have had in less capable aircraft. When we look back over the decades since World War II, we can see the P-47 Thunderbolt as more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of American industrial prowess, a testament to human ingenuity, and a tool that helped change the course of history. Attacks on shipping in the North Sea represent only one chapter in the Thunderbolt's long history. but it is a chapter that perfectly illustrates the qualities that made the aircraft so exceptional. Devastating firepower, unparalleled ruggedness, remarkable versatility, and courageous pilots willing to take the fight to the enemy wherever they were found, whether 10,000 meters in the air or a few meters above the icy waves of the North Sea. The stories of these pilots, these missions, these battles deserve to be remembered. They remind us of the cost of freedom, the courage required to face tyranny, and the importance of never underestimating the determination and ability of those who fight for just causes. The P-47 Thunderbolt and its pilots faced ridicule and turned it into respect. They faced doubt and responded with accomplishment. They faced danger and responded with courage. This is the essence of their legacy, a story that continues to inspire and educate more than 80 years later. May we always remember the lessons of this history. May we never underestimate what we do not fully understand. May we value versatility and adaptability over doctrinal rigidity. May we recognize that victory comes not only from superior equipment, but from the combination of good design, excellent training, individual courage, and collective determination. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the men who flew it taught us these lessons through their actions in the skies over Europe and the waters of the North Sea. It is a legacy that should not be forgotten. May the Lord God bless all those who served, those who sacrificed, and those who continue to defend freedom and justice in our world. May their stories of courage and dedication continue to inspire future generations, and may we never forget the price that was paid to secure the freedoms we enjoy today. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately a story of extraordinary people doing extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. It is a story that deserves to be told, remembered, and honored.